I'll keep my distance. Okay. So I hope this works for the people on Twitch. I've managed, besides losing the little stuff that allows me to see through my glasses, I've also lost my microphone. So this is just a lovely day. I want to talk today about sugar, coffee, tobacco, cocoa, and rum, the addictive drugs of the American colonies. We can't really understand the American colonies unless we think about drugs. And I want to think not just about, and this is probably where I differ most from Watson about this period, because I believe that the Americas, what we think of as North America, is effectively useless and worthless in the 17th century without the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is worthless and useless without drugs. What do I mean by that? Well, we now know that sugar is a drug. And an important process we talked about, that shift, that with the spread of Islam comes the spread of a new kind of production of sugar. First, initially in India, but then as Islam spreads west through the Mediterranean. And by the time the Portuguese create a system for the production of sugar, we have a system that is a factory in the field. The closest thing that we have to a factory in this period, in fact, the word factory comes from these buildings that the Portuguese put up on the coast of Africa, on these islands, and elsewhere. We used to think about a factory as a place where there's a steam engine or some other source of power. This is a human-powered factory, and the humans who are producing this are enslaved people. And sugar changes Europe. This is, on the left, the price of sugar, the real price of sugar in pence per pound from 1600 to 1850. And as you see, it's plummeting. This is not because there's lower demand, because you can see on the right, the demand is drastically increasing. That's consumption of sugar on the right. What's increasing at a spectacular pace is the supply. And that supply is coming from the Caribbean. There are other drugs that we associate with this period, and one of them is coffee. This is an English coffee house in 1650. This is where, in fact, the parliamentarians, the Roundheads in Oxford, first dreamed up a parliamentary system that would overthrow the king. These coffee houses were places where people consumed drugs. The coffee shop was seen as a medicine initially, something that sharpened your wits, drove away sleep, and restrained lust. So unlike alcohol, the idea was that coffee kept back lust. We now know that this is concentrated caffeine that people were taking in 1650. Which is also in tea, a substance first produced in China and consumed by people in China for thousands of years before coffee. Coffee has the same story in terms of the real price, which plummets from 1650 to 1850, and consumption, which skyrockets. Not so much in the 1700s, but right around 1800, we see coffee explode in terms of even as the price of coffee is dropping. Well, what's happening? What's happening is that these start as upper class things. Sugar, as I said, was the dowry of a princess in the 14 or 1500s. By the 1700s, this slave-produced sugar is so cheap that you can buy it in any store. and the price just continues to drop. Coffee, likewise, something that was consumed initially in upper class houses. This is the first coffee shop in Europe, the Café Sadullah Pasha, established in 1683 in Vienna. Coffee was initially associated with the Ottoman Empire. The town of Mocha, where, and it's still a brand of coffee that you can get in Mocha, which is in what is now Yemen. See there in the Gulf of Aden. And this area was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And so it was initially an Ottoman monopoly on cotton. And so coffee shops had this sort of Turkish, the Ottomans are the Turks, they had this sort of Turkish appearance that people had. And coffee makers and brewers were famous Turks who lived in Europe. All right, what happens? How does this change? The Ottomans have a monopoly on coffee. Coffee is initially in the 1500s and 1600s something that only elites drank. The solution, as Europeans see it, is to steal that coffee tech. And this is, as you can see these stars here in Europe, those are royal greenhouses, which simulate the appearance of, simulate the conditions that exist closer to the equator where coffee is grown. So coffee beans are grown in Leiden in the Netherlands. They're grown in London. They're grown in Whitehall. They're grown in Antwerp. Where else am I looking? They're grown in Paris. They're grown in Hamburg. They're grown outside of Berlin. These are royal greenhouses. Between 1690 and 1720, European agents stole coffee plants from Yemen and then set up massive greenhouses in Europe to preserve them. This is also part of war capitalism. This is also part of creating a series of goods that can be consumed, or are likely to be consumed by large numbers of people, as well as creating the labor system that makes it possible to produce this cheaply. Remember I talked about the Dutch setting up the University of Leiden in 1675 in the middle of their war against the Holy Roman Empire? Remember the Hanseatic League, that Hanseatic advantage was that they had colleges. But these colleges were not just about educating accountants and bookkeepers, but also about stealing commodities. I taught in Leiden about 5 years ago, and on the way to work where I was teaching, I walked by the Imperial Greenhouse, which has existed in Leiden since about 1680. And it was there that people figured out how to transplant coffee, and then figured out the best temperature to grow it at, and then where to grow it. These were transported as plants across the Atlantic. By 1750, the French have coffee in Martinique. The Portuguese are growing coffee plants in Brazil. And the Dutch have coffee plantations in Java. And coffee plantations are similar to sugar plantations in that they rely on enslaved workers coming from Africa, producing in large quantity these drugs. Coffee in Britain was mostly an upper class drink, while most poor people in Britain got their caffeine from tea. What's crucial is that all these goods, it's kind of ironic now, because mostly wealthy people that drink tea and poor people that drink coffee. But then, in the 1600s, it was rich people who drank coffee and poor people who drank tea. Who tried to steal the coffee again, someone asked. It's basically every European empire. And the ones who were most successful were the French, the Portuguese, and the Dutch. And where do they go? They go to within 10 degrees of the equator, because that's the only place you can grow coffee in this period. has to be very warm. It's actually 10 to 15 degrees. So consider how complicated this is. The Dutch, the English, and the Portuguese steal coffee beans from Yemen, transplant them to universities and royal gardens in the 1650s, then pay other groups to steal people from Africa, transport them on ships to the New World, force them to grow coffee, dry the beans, and then ship the beans back to Europe to go into coffee cups. This, too, is war capitalism, creating commodities which are going to become irresistible to people. And the fact that these are drugs is crucial, because once you've had a few coffees, as you know, you stop drinking coffee, you'll start to get headaches. Sugar, you'll have withdrawal as well. Most of these drugs depend on a kind of chemical reaction in the brain that I'm going to talk about a little bit that makes it perfect for reaching Europeans. Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. There is very likely to be a quiz today. The greenhouses in Europe are the only ones that were made. None were attempted anywhere else. That's right. The greenhouses were in Europe. There weren't any greenhouses in Africa or the New World that were trying to do this. What you need is a king. You need 75 ships. You need to hire people to go undercover in Yemen to steal the beans. It's an incredibly costly operation. This is where biology starts as a discipline, right? This is where biology starts as a discipline, is trying to figure out which of these drugs can be reproduced to be sold abroad. Why did the Europeans have to steal coffee beans? Could they not purchase it? Yes, they could, but they couldn't be sold the raw beans that you planted. They could be sold the dried beans. The Ottomans would sell them the dried beans, but they wouldn't sell them the beans you could plant because they wanted to keep the monopoly. Does that make sense? That's why you need to hire spies. Right, so spies in Yemen were stealing the coffee beans, and these are imperial spies, spies paid by the British, the Dutch, the French, and even the English empires. They stole them from Yemen, transported them as baby plants all the way back to Europe, where they were planted in greenhouses and where they'd be monitored to be able to figure out the best time to plant them, the best time to harvest them, what makes them biggest. And this is where biology as a discipline comes from. We don't have biology until the 1650s, when war capitalism gets its real start. So it's a world of transplanted Africans that provides these goods to the New World. So we can't understand Europe, we can't understand Europe's wealth unless we understand that these plantations are vital for European growth and development. Another institution very similar to coffee, very similar to sugar. There were sugar shops in Britain. There were also tobacco shops, and this is one in the Netherlands in the 1660s. Tobacco is mostly a North American product, widely used along with 100 other medicinal herbs by Native Americans, but tobacco is by far the most addictive. Nicotine is the active agent. European spies are how the goods got to Europe, and then the goods were transported from Europe to the New World, basically on the ships that came over with people. Nicotine is a poison that's excreted by tobacco plants that prevents insects from eating them. It actually doesn't prevent insects from eating them. Insects will eat a tobacco plant. The neurological toxin in tobacco will enter the bug's bloodstream, crossing their blood-brain barrier into the bug's brain, and then causing paralysis and death. All right. So 1 million years ago, a tobacco plant came up with this solution to eliminating the bugs that were eating it. Does that make sense? Well, it turns out that nicotine does the same thing in humans. It just doesn't kill us. We have dopamine receptors and then dopamine transporters inside our brains. And vesicles, and when you have sex, when you exercise, when you defeat your rival at table tennis, there's a rush of dopamines that go from the transporter to the receptor to give you a feeling, that rush of that all of us crave, not just humans but most mammals as well. This process takes place. Well, the nicotine molecule crosses the blood-brain barrier and binds itself to the ACH receptor in the brain, and then keeps it firing. So it doesn't need a dopamine transmitter. It's just got the dopamine receptor, and it jiggles it and causes our pulse to race when we smoke a cigarette. How do these drugs get transported across Europe? I mean, you can produce coffee in say, Mocha, or produce coffee in Barbados and send it back to Europe. Well, it turns out that the people who transmit the passion for these drugs is primarily sailors. And those sailors are mostly rounded up by press gang. That's where men were forced to, basically they would go around to bars towards the evening. They would offer a person 3 or 4 drinks, and then they would haul them out in an inconspicuous corner or alleyway, knock them over the head, and they were sailors the next day. This is called taking the king's shilling, in which you were basically rounded up in bars. And so people who were somewhat susceptible to drugs, alcohol, are rounded up and put on as sailors on sailing ships. And this happens in every empire in Europe. Sailors are the poorest of the poor. They're the lowest of the low. And these are the people who, because they're on ships, have access to many of these goods, including tobacco and coffee and sugar. And so the same thing happens with tobacco prices. Tobacco prices go down, not because demand goes down, because demand goes up, but the supply is increasing rapidly. And this, again, is war capitalism. This, again, is a process of producing goods that people can consume. The final one is cocoa. Cocoa drink was an Aztec invention made from cocoa beans. It had no sugar in it. It was pretty sour. Not sour, but imagine cocoa without the sugar. That's what the cocoa drink was. And this was the drink for elites. When Cortez takes Tenochtitlan, he goes into the cavern where all of the valuables of the Aztec Empire is, thinking it's going to be filled with gold and silver, and it's filled with cocoa. He doesn't understand how important cocoa will be. Cocoa, like tobacco, is a North American export. Cocoa beans were a currency in Aztec society. Tobacco prices went down. Why? Because the supply went up again and again and again as all of these nations, all these European empires start to produce more and more tobacco. So the price goes down, but consumption goes up. Does that make sense? It's confusing, right? It's confusing that the price would go down as consumption is going up. The only way that happens is if supply far outstrips demand. And that's precisely what happens. And as the price goes down, more and more people find that they have a few extra nickels to spend on these goods. In Europe, cocoa quickly becomes associated with the highest level of the aristocracy in Britain and France. And so the people who drank cocoa in 1708 ended up at White's Chocolate House in St. James, London. What does caffeine do in coffee? Let me talk a little bit about, because there's caffeine in coffee and there's caffeine in cocoa, in smaller amount. Caffeine breaks down into these 3 things: paraxanthine, theobromine, and theophylline. And one of these, paraxanthine, is actually in cocoa as well. This is why you shouldn't give chocolate to dogs, because chocolates, if you give chocolate to dogs, the pyraxanthine enters their livers and it'll kill them. Enough cocoa will kill a dog. The effects then of these, the caffeine drugs and the cocoa drugs, they produce heightened brain activity, the caffeine. They increase the flow of, you can read this, the flow of oxygen and nutrients to the brain. They increase athletic performance. And as well, the theophylline increases heart rate and the ability to concentrate. Theophylline is a drug that's now given to people who are in distress. Sailors had an endless supply of tobacco. The question was, sailors had an endless supply of tobacco, and what most of these goods that came back on ships, the first people to sample them and use them were sailors. If you were a sailor and you had a spoon, you could take, and you often did, as your due, the goods that were on that ship. That's why things are in containers now. That's why most goods travel by containers, because the containers are locked and no one can steal it. But from the 13th century to the 20th century, anybody who worked on a ship, the expectation was that some of those goods would be spirited away. All right. Finally, sugar. Sugar has byproducts that are important. 100 pounds of sugar cane yields only 10 pounds of crystalline sugar, and that's brown sugar. White sugar, there wasn't white sugar basically in this period. Brown sugar was the most refined sugar that you could get. And over 50 pounds of what's called blackstrap molasses, which is a waste product. It's still sweet, but you guys have seen molasses, right? It's that black gooey stuff. That's the stuff that's left over from a sugar plantation. What do you do with that? Well, this is where New England comes in. Because just 100 years earlier, or just a couple of 100 years earlier, people had learned to take beer and wine and distill them to make whiskey and brandy. And brandy is actually, the word brandy is burnt wine, which is burnt wine. And so if you heat up and then cool down and take that's kind of the steam from that good. The steam has a higher alcohol content, and you cycle that down to a condenser. You do that 2 times, and you get whiskey or brandy. You have to be very careful about how you do it because there are all sorts of other things that can contaminate it. So I don't want you to. This is not really a how-to manual, but that condenser already exists on sugar plantations. That's how you make sugar. It's heating and condensing sugar. The trouble is, it's very complicated to take that what is it called, the molasses, and turn it into anything. And the thing that it's turned into, of course, is rum. But you have to carefully measure the temperature. You have to use lots of water and lots of wood. And there's not a whole lot of wood on plantations in the Caribbean. In fact, lots of wood is imported from the New World for this reason. And so the best place to take blackstrap molasses, which is a waste product, and turn it into alcohol is a place where wood is cheap. And that turns out to be, the Caribbean. New England. Okay, again, more than you need to know about the production. But the process is possible. It's technically possible to do this in the Caribbean, but mostly because of the availability of wood and the precise control that's required. New England ends up being a better place to produce this. Edward Vernon, popularly called Old Grogram because he wore grogram coats, or Old Grog because of his fondness for these coats made of silk and wool, creates for the Navy, the British Navy, a mixture of water, rum, sugar, and limes or lemons, which is called grog. And this is the alcohol that most sailors use. And the lemon or lime is to prevent scurvy because it gives them vitamin C. This is why British sailors were called limes. So this, addictive drugs. There are other drugs that are in the New World, but these addictive drugs are seen as acceptable by Europeans. Marijuana doesn't go over. Mushrooms don't go over. Other things that Native Americans are consuming in the New World don't go over. But the things that seem to be what we would kind of consider light drugs are the things that cross over. And what makes this possible is a transplantation of millions of Africans to the New World. That transplantation, I'm going to talk about what the slave trade is like, how it feels, but I've run out of time. I want to conclude with this picture. What was the molasses used again? The molasses was used to make rum, another drink. Molasses was also used, of course, you could put it on biscuits or something like that. You could cook bread cookies. There are other things that you can do with molasses, but molasses were particularly, because they were a waste product, they were easily transported to New England, which is just, a few hundred miles away by ship. This is Mr. and Mrs. Adams, one of the most famous pictures of British country life ever. Based on this picture, sorry, it's zoomed in too much. Based on this picture of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. Grog produced the drink for the British Navy. Molasses was used. What curiosity score equals full for backpack is full credit. Anything over 50 is full credit. Although, as you'll see, we'll comment on things that are incomplete. All right. What would you think Mr. Andrews' wealth would be the source of Mr. Andrews' wealth, if you just by looking at this picture? Andrews produced. What's going on in this picture? What do you see? Sorry, I'm trying to make this big enough so that you can see everything. Tobacco. It looks a little bit like tobacco. This is in the north of England. He's dressed elegantly on a plantation. This is actually in the north of England, so he's not on a plantation. But this is what's interesting. Yeah, Bennett, it's wheat. It's wheat there on the right. The implication. So Bennett has himself. Sorry, not Bennett. Mr. Adams has. And there are a bunch of mysteries about this picture. First, one of them is what's in her lap. You can't really figure it out. It appears to be unfinished. The look on her face is also suggests that she doesn't like sitting in for this picture very much. The dog is sniffing something. Oh, yeah. All right. Wheat is what he's posing with nice clothes and near crops. Wheat. It is wheat. Plantation. Mr. Adams, though, this is all a front for Mr. Adams. Mr. Adams has 20 villagers traveling to Africa to capture slaves and bring them to the New World. Mr. Adams is what's called the king's remembrancer. And he's the person who makes sure that the debts of the king by anybody are paid. This capital book. He basically makes himself one of the largest slave traders in Britain. But you won't see any discussion of that in any of the discussions of pictures of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, because In Britain, the sort of idea of these sort of country squires is that they build their own lives out of their own wealth. In fact, these are what are called the nabobs of Britain. People who made their wealth relatively quickly. It's from a word in India, the nabob. And in most cases, that wealth comes directly from the slave trade. The slave trade is invisible in Europe, even though it's all around you. It's in the sugar, it's in the coffee, it's in the tobacco, it's in the rum. Every commodity that Europeans are consuming, initially because they like them, and later because they can't do without them, comes from slave-produced commodities, and this too is war capitalism. Okay. Oh, and he's also armed, right. Okay, now I'd like to do a quiz. So go to ELC to do the quiz. I will make it available to you in a second. Sorry for the delay in all of this. Okay, and if you'd log into ELC and tell me if you can see the quiz. Yes. Okay. If you have an ELC accommodation or something like that, you'd like to go outside the room, that's fine. This is the quiz, and I'll see you guys on Monday. Thanks so much.